I didn't know that it was jokingly called the oral grief, but that's really funny.
Hello, I am Kay Anderson, and you are listening to Lost Spaces, a podcast that mourns the death of queer nightlife. Every episode, I talk to a different person about a venue from their past, the memories they created there, and the people that they used to know. This week, we are joined by Canadian singer-songwriter Ember Swift. Known for her unique jazz-influenced guitar playing and elastic vocals, Ember has released a whopping 12 albums since her first release way back in 1996. We started off talking about the Coral Reef, a lesbian bar in Ottawa that opened in the late 60s and closed in the year 2000, and a space where Ember went when she was a student in the city. As is the way with most of my interviews, though, the conversation morphed to discussing in a broader context what community means and the sense of abandonment that Ember felt from her own community after she fell in love with a man in the late 2000s. Is it Ottawan or Ottawanian?
What are you talking about?
What's the name of a person from Ottawa?
Oh, yeah. What is it? I don't know. I don't know. I don't remember. I'm not from that city. I've never had to answer that. I don't know. That is hilarious.
So you're not an Ottawanian?
I'm not an Ottawanian, Ottawan. I don't know. I'm not. I went to university there, and it's really the place I came out. And I spent a couple of years living in that region before moving to Toronto and moving back to Toronto. It's kind of the area where I'm from.
Mm-hmm. And so when you went to university, this was the first time you visited the Coral Reef?
Yes, I came out at 19, and I was at university at the time, in my first year of university. And it was during that year that I got involved with the women's community and got to know people, and that was considered a hotspot.
So I did a little bit of research and opened in 1968 and ran until the year 2000, which is quite incredible.
Yeah, it's amazing.
Do you remember your first time there?
Yes, I remember it really distinctly because I felt like I was doing something very illicit. The Coral Reef was situated in a parking garage, and at the time it was for the Rideau Center, which is still there. It's a big mall complex right downtown in Ottawa. And to enter the Coral Reef, you had to go into the parking garage through the same archway that cars would go through. It really didn't appear to be a place that a person was even permitted to walk or should walk. It's like almost you're putting yourself in harm's way of a car just popping up and running you over. You had to walk through this archway, and then there was this strange door that you then knocked on, and someone would open it for you and was present at the top of the stairs to be sure that you were in the right place. And then you had to descend a long staircase that was rather precarious. And once you got to the bottom, you were in this divey, kitschy basement bar that was one of the oldest queer bars in the country at the time.
And so this, the person that let you in, it wasn't like this little eye slot or anything, was it?
No, it wasn't, but it felt that way. And at that time in my life, or sort of slightly after, I went to a lot of queer bars around the country as a touring musician. You know, sometimes we would be there on a Friday night, the gig would be over, and we'd think, hey, well, where's the gay bar? And sometimes they were like that, where you had to almost have a secret handshake or a secret knock. It was very interesting, but that wasn't the case at the Coral Reef. We were able to get in.
And but did you have to answer questions that proved your queerness?
No, I don't think so. I think we had to just verify that we were intentionally going in there. Anyway, the bar was a dive. It was falling apart. It was old school. There were mirrors on the dance floor, on the floor of the dance floor, sort of a mirrored a mirrored type of tin that was shiny enough that you could dance on it and see your warbled reflection if you looked at your feet. And then there were mirrors on the ceiling of the dance floor and along the walls. And, it was the kind of place that was unfortunately carpeted in sections. You see some carpet and you think, ew, how long's that been there? It was a dive bar. It really held a lot of history in its decor.
And so how big was it? Like what kind of size? How many people would fit?
I don't remember, to be honest. I remember just it being large enough that I suppose, think about it, my brain puts it at about 100 capacity, but I don't know. I don't remember really distinctly. Mm-hmm. Like as a historical venue, my experience of it is pretty limited. I mean, I may have gone there less than 5 times, maybe 5. I didn't go there all the time. At the time, there were other bars that were just as active, if not more active, because it had become a bit, well, there it was. What year was that? Maybe 93 and 4. And those must have been the years when it was declining in popularity and was considered more kitschy, less cool. Because it really wasn't the place we hung out the most in. But I do feel grateful that I got to experience it because it's the one that stands out. Isn't that interesting? I went to many other bars, and there was a bar in Hull, Quebec, across the water. Hull had a different drinking age as well. It was 18, not 19. So some of my friends who hadn't turned 19 yet could drink in Hull, but not in Ontario, right? In Quebec, but not Ontario. So it was a very big thing to go across across the provincial border, across the river, and party in Hull. And there was a bar there called the Clubhouse, which was more of our haunt after a while, and was full of lots of drama. I remember bar fights and breakups and broken glass, and I remember just craziness. That was also back in the days you could smoke in the bars, and there was just going into these cloudy environments where everything was cloudy. Also, people's perception of reality was cloudy, not just from the alcohol, but from the actual lack of visibility in the space itself because of the smoke. And the Clubhouse is really more of the bar that I associate with where I experienced the nightlife of gay culture for the first time. And the Coral Reef was more of an occasional place that we went to, but it was less crazy, therefore less interesting to us young people. And when I remember going down into the Coral Reef and feeling like it was a place for the older lesbians, it was a slightly less happening, little less cool. And so I must have had kind of like a downgrade opinion of it then, as opposed to where we were partying more often.
You were slumming it for the evening.
Yeah, sort of like, okay, so we're not going across the water, so maybe we'll go here on Friday since it's Friday night. But of course, when you're 19, you have to go out every weekend night. So you had to also go out on Saturday. So Saturday would have been across the water, going across the Gatineau River to Hull, Quebec, where we would go to the Clubhouse, which was a different experience again. It's a foggy time in my memory, but I have fond memories of those days. And
so you have a memory of a place where there was drama and drinking and bar fights, and we're talking about somewhere else.
Yes, exactly. because the Coral Reef, which to me is more visible to my mind's eye in terms of its decor, because those things stuck with me. Seeing the way it was decorated and where it was situated, and the kind of the mystique of it being in a parking garage. But the Clubhouse, which was just this standalone bar, upstairs bar, which eventually burned down. It burned to the ground, I'm sure, because of some drama. I'm sure. I don't know the details of that, but when I heard it burned to the ground, I thought, well, that's fitting. That was really the place where there was more action. The Coral Reef it had all this history in the mirrored dance floor,
Just not for you.
Yeah, it's not so much for me because I came out at a time when it was already in its decline, when not many people were going there.
Just older women in cardigans.
Yes.
Well, so let's talk about you at that age then. You just moved for university.
Hmm.
And you said that you were kind of just coming out at that point as well.
That's right. Yeah.
What was that process like?
Well, I met my first girlfriend when I was 18, and we were sort of in the closet for a chunk of that year. We were at the same age. And when we both moved to Ottawa for university, it felt very liberating that there we were finally able to express that we were a couple and we were wanting to explore a bigger community. Because in the early days of your first romantic relationship as a queer person, it feels like you live in a bubble until your visibility is established within a small community. So I do remember that feeling, and this bar definitely was a part of that experience because I was part of a coming out group with other youth like myself and like my girlfriend at the time. And together we all, as a gang, went and explored the bar scene. And this was one of those nights of exploration. But I've thought of, since living in Asia, I know I'm here in Beijing, right? Mm-hmm. And I've thought of the Coral Reef since as this nostalgic memory because several of the rehearsal spaces that I've had to rent and go into as with my band and my players here have been situated in parking garages, like as well, very hard to find and around corners and past this dusty cement pillar. And then there's unmarked door. And there is this rehearsal studio in what looks like it should just be a pipe room, you know? When you think you just wouldn't walk in and see all the water pressure systems of the structure of the building you're in. Yeah. But there it is. There's this music studio. And it's made me think of the Coral Reef in the years that I've been here in Beijing. And I think part of it is around sound for rehearsal studios, because if you're in the basement where cars are parked, you're not disturbing neighbors, mm-hmm. You're not disturbing an office place. And in some cases, I think that's why a bar would have been set up in the basement of a parking garage, not just for discretion, but also for sound. They would have been completely muffled by all the cement. No one would have heard.
In all those fumes.
Well, suppose so, from the parking garage. But at that time, bars were running at night, and I suppose not very many people were parking in that garage at night.
Yeah,
very fascinating where things get set up and hidden.
So I wanted to ask, you just said you were part of a coming out group. Do you just mean that was like a loose group of friends that were coming out at the same time, or is there like an actual specific group?
There was a group. There was an Ottawa GLBT center, as there I'm sure still is, and they offered a coming out counseling group that was headed by someone who was more of an adult, so had been out for longer, but not much older, maybe 10 years older, and they were counselors. And it was a weekly meetup and a chat session, and then there were social things, and it was a way to make friends and not feel so alone. But this is in the early 90s, so this is a long time ago. I imagine that these groups still exist, but there's certainly much less of a need for them now, with so much more greater acceptance for non-hetero sexual identity, right?
Yes, yeah, no, absolutely. But it was like kind of like a peer support group.
Exactly.
Okay. Okay, so let's go back to the bar. Are there any particular nights that you remember being there?
My memories really stop at the decor. Honestly, I don't remember much. I don't remember dancing on that dance floor. I just remember that there were ways to see her face in the floor. And, I remember sitting at a table and chatting with people and looking around, but that's where my memories really stop. I don't have any grand dramas that happened in this bar, but I am grateful to have experienced it. I came out, and I'm of the age where I've watched a real transition in society towards, in terms of attitudes towards GLBTQ identity and visibility. So I'm not surprised the bar closed in 2000. And, what a wonderful run it had at 32 years.
Yeah, amazing.
So, but I think there's less and less need for separate bars for queer people. Less and less requirement for that.
And you think that because there's like a wider societal acceptance?
Yes. And, it's much easier to be out and not need the protective physical spaces of community that in which community can gather. And really that's what it was. You needed four walls and a person standing at the top of the stairs to verify that you were going to the right place for the right reasons. Because at that time, being out and being queer was a much more vulnerable. It was a much more vulnerable state to be in.
There's this kind of perception of Canada as being far more kind of accepting and liberal.
Is that true?
Is it true?
Well,
yeah. Well, I was about to like give illustrations of that because like equal marriage was legal in Canada far earlier than most countries, and I couldn't think of any other examples other than that. But yeah, so is that true?
Well, that example is pretty relevant. So usually that's the example that's used to suggest that it's true. Yes, I think it's true, but I also think there is always a segment of society that is more conservative, less accepting, and more resistant to this kind of diversity within society. So I think that exists in Canada as well. And to this day, we still don't live a fully 100% safe existence as queer people out in the world, but it's much more visible, much more accepting throughout the media. And these days, as I said, I'm not even sure that these youth coming out groups are as plentiful as they once were, or perhaps that's an indication that they're less necessary. But I don't know, because I'm not a spokesperson for this community anymore. I don't feel that I used to be more of a poster girl, and my queer identity was very front and center, and I was a public figure as a musician and a traveling musician at that. But I experienced a huge shift when I came to China, and a huge difference in the support that I had felt and the role that I had played in the queer community, particularly when I fell in love with a man in China. And my identity as queer always included sort of an occasional attraction to men, which, queer as the overarching term that includes bisexuality and transidentity and all these different identities under the queer umbrella. But it was amazing what happened for me when I came to China, and I felt very alienated by the queer community at that time. So, this can become a much deeper discussion about what queer space really means and what queer, this is a lost queer spaces, but queer space is not just a physical space. It's a psychological space where you feel safe and supported and loved and visible. But my visibility went because I was therefore in a heterosexual relationship and assumed to be heterosexual while people looked at me from the outside looking in. So my visibility disappeared, even though my queerness did not. I'm still very queer identified. I just happened to fall in love with a man on that occasion. And when that happened, I had a lot of backlash from my queer community and even some of my queer friends, my queer fan community, my music community, and some of my queer friends really turned their backs. And that was a time when I moved to China in 2008, but I fell in love in 2007 and really waffled on moving. Took a leap of faith, followed my heart. I'm very grateful I did that. I have no regrets. But when I look back at how that shifted my role as a spokesperson for the LGBTQ community, It was massive, that shift.
So let's so you've talked about the backlash from friends and fans. Can we talk about fans first? What did that look like?
Well, it took the form of a lot of email delete requests. I had a real barrage of abuse by email. At that time, email was the way that musicians let people know about their shows. There was still a big mailing list culture. I joined Facebook in 2007. It wasn't a very big forum then. Social media was just beginning. So the email method of getting news out about shows was the way that fans communicated with me and I communicated with fans. So I experienced several years, but especially that first year, of angry diatribes from people feeling that I had betrayed them because my decision to follow my heart and go to China and pursue the love, because love is love, right? was somehow tantamount to me being a traitor to the whole queer community and the queer movement. And that was very heartbreaking. I had to set up a system where I just categorically adhered to every delete request and sometimes responded in kind and sometimes didn't respond at all. Never became adversarial with those people and never tried to fight back, but was really shocked by that. I'm not sure that would happen now, another, 15 years later or, 13 years later. I'm not sure that kind of response would be felt because it would have happened more publicly, or it wasn't as private where someone could privately send a mean, evil message to the artist they saw as the poster girl for their queer coming out or their queer liberation. And they could get away with that because it wasn't so visible. Nowadays, it would be social media that would create that shift. So if I were in that role and then I fell in love with a man, that would be very public socially through the media sites. And then if anybody were to, troll that news, there would be people that would defend me,
Yeah.
And it would become a public discourse. But that's not the way it was at that time. That was one way that it manifested. Another way was simply in the lower numbers at my shows. And in sometimes, to some degrees, the absence of bookings. There were several queer presenters or venue owners that just stopped booking me.
Oh wow, like that extreme. And so
Yeah.
So the reason that they knew is because you were open about it, or because they'd heard rumors?
Well, at first it was a very big shift in my life that included breaking up with my ex-partner, who was one of my band members. We had a long-term relationship, and the breakup occurred really over China, less so over the love I had. We had an open relationship, so a lot of those details were missed by people on the outside. But the general nugget of understanding was that I had left my lesbian partner for a man in China. And you can imagine how that goes in the rumor mill. What an evil woman I am, right? To abandon her, that meant that she had to I was abandoning her livelihood as well. The truth is that all happened in 2007, and we split up in 2007, but we didn't stop playing together until 2008. Many, many months later, more than half a year later. And it was her decision to stop working with me, and which led to me deciding to just move to China and try it out. Just take a leap of faith, see how the relationship went, see if I could rebuild a music career in China. And, as I don't look back, I don't regret those decisions. I think they were the right decisions to make. They were the honest, brave decisions to make. But as a result, I don't feel that I can talk about my queer identity. I can talk about my queer journey in Canada, but my queer journey has taken many turns. And though that man in China is my ex-husband now, I recognize that my sexuality is a much broader story than it was before I met him. And I'm grateful for all those experiences.
And what do you mean by much broader?
Well, before I used to think of myself as an 80-20 queer. I sort of had this tagline. It's funny how we define ourselves and then we live within the boundaries of definition rather than the other way around, like to live and then have the life itself become that which defines us. It's when we're young, we tend to box ourselves up before we've had a chance to discover who we are. And my 80-20 box was that of every 10, of every 10 people that walked along that I found attractive, generally maybe 2 were male. So I considered myself to be an 80-20 queer, where I was 80% attracted to women and 20% attracted to men. And I just locked into that little term. Oh, I'm an 80-20 queer.
And there was some specific scientific experiments you did to determine this figure.
Yeah, it's so funny, hey? It's like as though there were, that I could come up with that statistic about myself and it could hold. It's very youthful to have that view. But, then I fell in love with a man, and it was just as legitimate a love as any other love I'd had with women. But I was in my 30s then, so it forced me to really examine my identity and what love really meant and what sexual attraction was for me and, all that stuff. Mm-hmm. And now I consider myself not locked into a definition that includes these falsified statistics, right? And I just say, I'm open. I'm capable of love with either gender. That means I'm technically bisexual, but I really love the term queer. It's been the word I've used for myself my whole life. It feels much more fluid and open as a word. And I'm always open about my queer identity. And therefore, I feel much less boxed in than I was before, thanks to this experience of pursuing the love that came into my life. Even though at the time, as queer people, we are often afraid to do things that are considered conventional because we already feel we live on the outskirts. We are the fringe, and we must maintain the fringe at all times in all choices. So everything we do ends up being fringe-like. Like our relationship style. There's many more poly and non-monogamous and open relationships in the queer community than there are in the straight community, for instance. Mm-hmm. Or our diets. So many more vegetarians, so many more, raw foodists in the queer world than there are per capita in the straight world. I find that very interesting. We have to be so different all the time about everything. And so when we find something that makes us more conventional, like suddenly my love with a man who was heterosexual is still heterosexual. And therefore that put me in view of everyone else as being in a heterosexual relationship, assumed to be a heterosexual myself. It's very disconcerting. It threw me off. I had to spend a lot of time, many years, really grappling with my identity after that.
And so how much of that was about that coming to terms with the way you'd self-identified for so long, and how much of that was about the way other people were responding to their relationship within that you were in at that time?
I'm sure that it was interconnected. I'm not sure I can separate those two things because how we are perceived ends up being how we perceive ourselves, or how we perceive and present ourselves ends up determining how we are perceived. I'm not sure we can separate those two things.
But so if we're looking at this 80-20 rule that you'd self-defined, had you been in relationships with men before?
I had not been in love with a man. Well, I had a boyfriend in high school that, I had teenage love with, but I'm not sure that I had adult love with a man before I fell in love with my ex-husband in my 30s. Mm-hmm. But I had little things and experiences, which I knew that I had the capacity to be sexually attracted to men, just much more rarely than I was with women or women.
Mm-hmm. So that in itself wasn't kind of a strange thing for you, falling in love?
The falling in love with a man was strange because as an adult, I hadn't fallen in love with another man until my 30s with this Chinese guy across the world who couldn't speak English, who was heterosexual. It was a very weird collection of data about him. But there it was. It was a new adventure. Off I went.
And And so we talked about the backlash from fans. What were some of the things that were happening with friends and colleagues?
There was a division that happened, as often happens with breakups, where mutual friends of ex-partners end up choosing sides of some sort. That's tragic, but predictable. It's tragically predictable, I'd say. But that's okay too, because I often see friendships in the same light as I see partnerships. Sometimes they just run their course. You just have to move on. And I came to understand that those who were supportive of my decisions to go across the world and pursue this connection and take a leap of faith, I had to really begin my life again. Those who supported that and who stood by me were the real friends. And those who did not were not worth my despair, really. Right?
Yeah. Yeah. But was it just like that they started ghosting you? Or was it?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I suppose that happened. Or that there were some real distinct divisions that happened with correspondence. People fell out of touch. It's not easy to stay in touch with community, actually. And I really appreciate the idea of, back to the notion of your podcast, right? It is about lost spaces. But I have experienced a lot of lost spaces in my life, not just the physical queer spaces like the Coral Reef that is no longer open, but I've experienced the lost geographic national space of my country, choosing to live overseas for so long. And now when I go back to Canada, I sometimes don't feel that I'm even of Canada anymore. I'm not entirely sure I'm comfortable in Canada. And then, as I just spoke about, the lost psychological space, the community space of the queer community when I experienced the backlash. But I'm happy to report that after so many years, I still feel that I have a solid core-based group of friends, both overseas back in Canada, and that I've developed since being here in this country, that is both queer and not queer, but very solid. And, I feel really grateful for the opportunity to rebuild. It was good.
This thing about belonging is really interesting. Like so I was born in Scotland. My family emigrated to Australia, and I moved back to the UK as an adult. And like what you've just said about when you go back to Canada, not necessarily feeling like you belong anymore, really resonates. And it's this weird thing when you've lived somewhere else, you don't belong in either place. You're an outsider in both, but you do belong in both as well.
Yeah, I think there's a belonging that's indisputable in both, but from whose perspective, I should say, the belonging is a historical belonging in some ways, and perhaps we always are tied to the places or the spaces that have held us safe. But sometimes there are those who believe we don't belong and who take possession of that space. And I think ultimately it really depends on perspective. And in the end, when you have all those debates as to who belongs where or whether you yourself belong, in the end, I think it becomes this just giant knotted thing, like a ball of yarn that's been knotted too much, and then you might as well just throw it in the garbage. Like, it just doesn't matter. It doesn't really matter where I'm from or where I belong, or it doesn't really matter. That's what I've come to in my more mature years.
No,
Who cares?
Yeah, but there's this thing, isn't there, of like, I understand everything that's happening here culturally, and I was part of this, but this isn't me anymore. And it's not necessarily like that you are bothered or care about that, but it's just this kind of weird thing to experience, I suppose, when you go to a country that you grew up in, when you go to a country that you identify with, and you're suddenly like, oh, this is familiar but foreign.
Yeah, well, do you feel that within that experience, do you fight with the notion of entitlement within that experience, that you ought to be entitled to an opinion of that space because you were once of that space, or the flip, that you are no longer entitled to have a view or a say in that space because you're no longer of that space?
I think it would be the latter for me. I mean, I'm terribly polite and don't want to kind of impose on anyone. So it would always be that. Oh, here I am, just living up to your stereotype. That outsider perspective.
Mm, that's interesting. Well, for me, I often look at that sort of as though I'm standing outside of myself. Think, well, why am I here? Both when I go back to Canada, when I come back to China as an expat, a long-term expat here, and I've made this a secondary home, and also when I'm in a queer space as well, I have that same experience. In fact, just last night, I went to a party that was hosted by a lesbian couple with brand new baby, and they're sort of like 50-50 in terms of the attendance to the party. Maybe half were queer and half were not. And there was just an energy there that felt very familiar. They're an American couple, by the way. They're an expat couple. And everyone in attendance was not Chinese. So it felt like I was stepping into an overseas experience while being in China. And then the familiarity of the queer energy was something I felt very nostalgic, and I feel very comfortable. I came of age in that community. And then the analyzing of the being in an expat party while in a foreign country. So we're just helicoptered in. We're not really of this space. All of that, I find that all really fascinating. So I just sit back and check out how I feel within it. And I don't know. Occasionally I feel quite entitled to a view. Especially let's just zero in on one, the queer community and the queer identity. I feel very entitled to say, I'm a queer person. Yes, I'm entitled to a view on these topics. And despite having been married for a long time and being in an invisible queer relationship, invisible for my own identity, I should say, I was a queer person in a heterosexual relationship. I'm even more. There's a bit of I'm even more entitled because I experienced invisibility, and there's a type of oppression in there. And then other times, I'm also terribly polite, and I say, actually, I don't really have a voice here anymore, and I don't need a voice anymore. I don't need to be on a platform or on a podium. I don't need my lyrics to fight this fight anymore. I'll pass on the baton or the torch, and I'll stand on the sidelines and raise my fist with everyone else. But it's not as pressing for me to take up that space, possess that space any longer. That could be just age. I became a musician as someone who loves music. I, of course, had been writing music for a long time, long before I came out as an artist. But the queer community and the early LGBTQ events and bars really helped to establish me as an artist. Without that community, I'm not sure if my career would have grown as quickly or as robustly as it did. So I'm really grateful to the queer community for all the support the community gave me. But I realized that music and sexual identity are very different. They're separate things. It just so happened that they were co-connected in that development stage of my life. But when I released Lentic and then really realized that I needed to continue to make music for the rest of my life, that I'm a music maker, regardless of my sexuality and regardless of where I am positioned socially, that was a very important thing for me to come to in my life. It was a very important eureka.
And so you say that the queer community that was helped in the development of your career, that was kind of more in the championing you as an artist.
Yes. Well, there's a type of possessiveness that the women's community used to have. I'm not sure how much it has it now. Perhaps that still exists, but before, when queer identity was much more risque and more an identity that made a person more vulnerable in society, the queer community, and particularly I can speak from the perspective of the women's community, would really possess and wrap the wings of protection around around the lesbian artists, the queer identified female artists. So there were women's festivals there were women's events that would specifically seek out the artists that were making music. It was music made by women for women in some cases. And sometimes those artists were making music that was entirely about the theme of women loving women. That wasn't my situation. I was an artist that was writing songs about a lot of global issues, but I was among artists who were specifically just trailblazing for female queer visibility. Mm-hmm. And I respect that. That was a specific path that they chose. And I found that whole community very fascinating, because if a community wraps its arms around musicians and claims them, they then support them, and the community becomes really essential to their survival, their sustainability, right? And then, of course, with the backlash that happened, my sustainability kind of fell apart. And I realized, oh, right, there is a possessiveness that happens to protect the queer community and the queer musicians within the community. But there's the flip of that. When it's an extreme protection, there's also an extreme rejection that can happen as well.
Well, this is where we get back to entitlement, isn't it? That like, I've supported you, so this is how your art should be.
Yes, exactly. And that was the kind of delete request messages. Those were the kinds that I was getting. Like, how dare you stop being the artist I have assumed you to be, because I have supported you to maintain this identity, and this, and your new path is in contradiction to that. So therefore, I regret having ever supported you, because you're a traitor to my views and to my identity.
Doesn't that just fuck with your head? Sorry, I know that's what we've been talking about for the last hour, but that's just because it is this, you know, when you've been striving to create music and connect with people and to tell your story and to be understood, when that's in threat, when suddenly it's like, oh, people aren't going to be interested if I go this way, or if I do this, or if I do this, it really makes you question everything about yourself and your instincts, which is horrible.
Absolutely. And ultimately, at the time, as an activist, part of my activist banner, for lack of a better word, was of course visibility for the queer community. But I was also talking about a lot of environmental issues and political transparency and a bunch of different topics. I was very vocal at that time. That was an era of activism through art. And you want to be a voice for the marginalized communities when you are an artist in that role. But you also don't want to be trapped by the marginalized communities either, because who needs to hear the issues? Those who are not in the marginalized communities, right? So you don't want the marginalized communities to possess you to such a degree that your voice can't be heard outside of those communities, because then the activism is just preaching to the choir. The activism isn't actually affecting those who need their minds opened about certain issues, who maybe haven't thought about those issues before. And it ends up being a catch-22. So yeah, it does really just mess you up when you have to deal with that kind of push-pull and the entitlement, the possessive entitlement, but very eye-opening. And as I said, I have no regrets. I really appreciate those learning experiences that I went through. And it did reshape my whole view of not just myself, but of what community means and what marginalized community does well and what it doesn't do well, or at that time, in terms of its connectedness to the arts. And I always have held that, even though I'm very grateful for the queer community and the support that I had as an early artist from that community, I am not just a queer person who makes music. I'm a musician, first and foremost. And I want that music to reach people, period, the end. Not a specific type of people. It's not music just for one subculture, you know? And moving outside of my country, living as overseas as an outsider, was also very important to really drive that point home. I want to make music for people, period, not just Not just expats, for instance, not just white people, not just women, not just queers.
Okay, so let's go back to the bar. And if you could go back in time and meet yourself as a 19-year-old at the Coral Reef, have a drink with her, what would you say?
That's a great question. Let me pause for a second. What would I say to the me at 19? I think if I could speak to the 19-year-old me of the past, or if it would ever get through, which it wouldn't, I would want to say to that aged me, or anyone that age, that everything I think about myself and the world, I am taking too seriously. I would say that to myself. I'd say, you're taking it all too seriously. Step back, take a break, take a breath, relax. And I would be offended. I would offend my 19-year-old self because I was so righteous. At 19, I was so righteous that I knew everything and knew about the world and was very adult. And I know now that I certainly wasn't, and that I was over investing in certain self-identities and certain opinions and politics and so many things that we end up, as I said, latching onto. When I spoke earlier about building our boxes and then living our lives rather than allowing our lives to define us, we did it the wrong way. And I think if I could get that message through in a casual, joking way that somehow resonated with the 19-year-old me, that would be a victory. But I doubt I would be able to get the message through because you can't. You're so rigid at that time in your life. And I would look at the 46-year-old me and I would think, who is this old lady who thinks she knows what she's fucking talking about? And I would clink her glass and I would say, she's just old and jaded. And I would think that under my breath and I would roll my eyes and think, I hope she's not hitting on me.
Did you ever go to the Coral Reef? Well, if you did, tell me all about it. Find me on Insta, Twitter, and Facebook with the username KAndersonMusic and tell me all about what you got up to. You can also find out more about Ember by following her on Instagram. Her username is Ember Swift, and she has a new album planned for this year, so make sure that you're checking for that. Lost Spaces is not only a podcast, but a concept record as well. I've been writing songs about queer venues and the people who used to live their lives there, and will be releasing songs over the next year. You can hear the first single, Well Groomed Boys, which is also playing underneath my talking right now on all streaming platforms. If you like this episode, I would really appreciate if you subscribed, left a review on Apple Podcasts, or just told people who you think might be interested in having a listen to. I am Kay Anderson, and you have been listening to Lost Spaces.